Carl Lissenmeyer, Vice President of the Kent County Historical Society, and now Emeritus Editor of Northern Kentucky Heritage. And I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Arnold Taylor is a retired lawyer from Northern Kentucky and happens to be our program director on our society's board. Such a subject, to me, was surprisingly interesting, as we have published some parts of his book and did a review on his book, which is available. Where is it? Out there at the table?
There.
Oh, there, out there. Okay. I'm sorry, I forgot to. All right. Well, I'd like to introduce you and you will be surprised that the process of supplying clean water to a community is unusually and amazingly complex and fascinating in the 19th century on. So without further talk, Arnold Taylor.
Thanks, Carl, and thank you all for coming. Considering the weather that you've had in this area the last several days with flooding of the water, I was kind of thinking that nobody'd be interested in hearing more about water. But it is an important subject. You can go a long time without food, but you can't go very long without water. So, when Covington was originally established, there was, of course, no water supply other than the two rivers. But despite the fact that we had two rivers, there was always what they referred to regularly as water famine. There wouldn't be simply enough water to go around. I can't tell exactly what you can see from your seats, and the red thing does not seem to be particularly working, but at the bottom you'll see an indication of a spring and a well. When Covington was very early on, those were the two sources of water supply, if you didn't dip it right out of the river. And then as time went on, of course, wells were dug, and you'll see an indication of a couple of indications of wells on the map. These are not the only wells that were located over the course of time, of course, but I put those up to show you that there were wells, and then there was one marked as closed. I think that's what I called it. And the reason I said closed is because even though wells existed, the city didn't want to keep them up. The well that was closed that I mentioned or referred to on the map, it was a situation where the city decided that if the people that were local around the well didn't want to keep it up, the city wasn't going to, and they were going to close it down, they were going to fill it up. Now the city did have a system of cisterns, but these were a problem in themselves, and the cisterns had a tendency to leak. But beyond that, if it didn't rain, or you didn't pump the water out of the river to the cisterns, then what good were the cisterns? So they did have some of those, but one of the problems with cisterns was that they would clog up with mud and debris from the roadways. And the fire department, or the fire engines at one point that served the area around what's now Mother of God Cemetery, refused to use the cistern because it was always so clogged up with mud that it would clog their hoses. So there were systems of water supply in a rudimentary fashion, but they weren't very effective, and in times of drought, maybe they weren't very useful at all. But jumping ahead to after the Civil War, by the 1867 period, it was a time in which the water scarcity was the worst, as the newspapers put it, in years. And that if there weren't any rain, if there wasn't any rain, the cisterns were going to be empty. And as I said, there were always problems with cisterns leaking, and some new ones had been installed in that time period of 1867, but again, there were problems. Now, the next part of this story, I want you to see these names: Vincent Schenkel, James M. Clarkson, and Robert Howe, and then James P. Patton. And I'll tell you more about them as we go on. In September of 1867, Schenkel and Clarkson and Howe were appointed as a committee to contact the Cincinnati Water Works and see whether some contract could be worked out for Cincinnati to supply Covington with water. Now, a bit about those folks, which is kind of important, I think, for you to know. First, I didn't put up a slide about Schenkel, because if you're from here, you know about the Schenkel family, of course, how powerful they were, how invested in businesses and so forth they were. But Clarkson was a dealer in stoves, hollowware, manufacturer of copper and sheet iron, and he was a pretty wealthy fellow. Howe was a grocer and distiller. Patton, I won't say much about, and I won't say much about until a few minutes, was more of a small fry. He was a Covington council member at this time, but he was much smaller in terms of business and wealth. Schenkel and Clarkson and Howe worked with the Cincinnati Water Works to devise a potential contract by which the Cincinnati Water Works would run a 30-inch pipe under the river over to Front Street near Madison, and that was going to cost, the piping was going to cost $30,000, which is about $500,000 today. And the idea is that Covington would pay for the materials, and then as people subscribed to the water system, the water rents would go to Covington until the money was paid back, and then after that, Cincinnati Water Works and Covington would split the income after that. In October of 1867, Covington City Council approved the contract. Well, the first thing that happened was that there was this lawsuit by the Cincinnati brewers, or some of the Cincinnati brewers. Some of them were having water problems of their own. The papers reported that some of the brewers were even employing suction to get water out of the Cincinnati Water Works lines for their breweries. So they filed a lawsuit to get an injunction against the implementation of the contract, and they were ultimately successful because it was an illegal contract. The city of Cincinnati was authorized by statute to sell water to contiguous counties and cities. Well, that was contiguous in Ohio, not in Kentucky. So as a result, ultimately the contract fell through. Now, there was a lot of fallout from this failure, and there were two investigations, which I'll tell you about in a bit. But I want to tell you the real story of what happened. I spent 52 years as a trial lawyer, and part of what I had to do was to hear different people telling different versions of the same story and ferret out from what everybody said as to what was the likely truth of the events. And what happened, I believe, was this. Clarkson and Schenkel got in contact with a guy named James Fitzgerald, who was a Cincinnati councilman, and he was also chairman of the Cincinnati Water Works. And they talked to him about getting a contract for the supply of the water to Covington. Well, Fitzgerald said that in order to arrange that contract, he wanted $5,000. He wanted $500 up front, and then if the contract was ultimately let, he wanted another $4,500. But he didn't want to be paid himself. He wanted it paid through his bagman, a lawyer named H.W. Myers, who was a known influence peddler. And so Clarkson and Schenkel, Howe stayed out of this for some way. I don't know how he managed to do it, but he stayed out of it. But Clarkson and Schenkel approached James Patton who was a council member, and said that they would like him to support the idea of giving this money to Myers to get the contract put through, because Fitzgerald had told Clarkson that Myers was the man to get it put through. So Patton agreed to this, and then after it was discovered that the contract was no good and the investigation started, there was testimony by a whole bunch of people about a whole bunch of things, but essentially the story was, in my view, that the money was paid and then the Covington got nothing for it. Now, when the investigation started, Schinkel and Clarkson called Patton a liar and said every word was fabricated and so forth and so on. But as I say in the book, if you look at the things that were said, I mean, they admitted that Fitzgerald had been contacted, so they were just denying it just to deny it. There were investigations, an investigation by the Covington City Council, and the report from the Covington City Council Investigative Committee was essentially, yeah, this is what happened. But it was a whitewash because they said this was irregular, but Clarkson and Schinkel had this in the best interest of the city. Now, $4,500 is $80,000 or so today. And can you imagine that anybody from Covington City Council or any city council confronted with this kind of factual situation, which was essentially admitted, would say, well, it was okay, it was in the best interest of the city. Well, it didn't stop there. There was also an investigation by the Cincinnati Council. And there was a lot of testimony that was reported in the newspapers. And again, that's where I say that Clarkson and Schinkel called Patton a liar. But it was another whitewash, and the Cincinnati Council determined that there had been no bribery, that all of this was the result of scurrilous reporting by the newspapers and reporting of unfounded rumors. Now, what do we call that today?
False news.
So, it's not a new phenomenon, but you blame the newspapers for reporting rumors. The problems didn't end there, though. Of course, the Covington had contracted with the piping manufacturer from Cincinnati for the $30,000 of piping, so they're on the hook for the payment of this, and so they argued that the piping contract was invalid because the underlying contract was invalid, and I don't think that would have ever flown, but the Cincinnati Piping Company filed suit, and so that was going on, all this. And this was all too much for Patton. He introduced a resolution at City Council that the city sue Clarkson and Schinkel, and that motion was tabled. They just didn't want to hear any more about this. They were sick and tired of this, and they just wanted to move on. Now, they could move on, but a water supply was still needed. And from time to time, there would be private individuals who would form companies with the authorization of the Kentucky legislature. And back then, the legislature was the one that authorized cities to do things or to incorporate a business. So, for the third time, a business was incorporated known as the Newport Covington Water Company. And so some private investors were thinking about having reservoirs installed above Newport. Well, that never got in play, actually, because at the same time, the mayor of the city ran across the Holly fire suppression system. Now, the Holly fire suppression system was a system whereby water was pumped under pressure through pipes to hydrants. And so the obvious value to pumping the water under pressure to hydrants and then through hoses into a burning building were obvious. But there was a secondary benefit in that water could also serve for domestic uses, to pump it to houses and businesses and so forth. This is a gentleman named Birdsall Holly who invented this fire suppression system, And he's an interesting guy. His father died when he was very, very young and had to go to work and all that. But when he died, he was only second place to Thomas Edison in terms of holders of patents. So he did a lot of design work, and this Hawley suppression system was one of his inventions. So in January of 1870, a test well was dug at the corner of northwest corner of Main and 2nd Streets. Now, this well was dug to go into the part of the bank that was not underwater, but to dig down below the water level, of course. And the idea was that to determine whether water could be taken from a well with the gravel bed being used as a filter. So the water wasn't designed, or the system wasn't designed to take water directly from the river. It was designed to take it from a well that would be dug, which of course through the water table would be from the river ultimately. This shows you the location of the well and what was ultimately the water plant. A contract was signed with Hawley in February of 1870, and that's when construction actually began on the building and the well, the completion of the well. Now the good news about this was, remember the piping manufacturer was suing? Well, the good news was, okay, the piping's ready to go. So after some negotiation, the pipes installation began and moved along pretty quickly. In March of 1871, there was a public test of the system, and everybody seemed to be happy with it. Some commissioners were appointed to be commissioners of the waterworks. And unfortunately, complaints began almost immediately. Now, the idea of the water being drawn from the well was, according to a chemist who gave opinion at the time, the water would become softer and softer as the gravel was washed with the water coming in from the water table and being pumped up. It would become softer and softer. But it turned out that that wasn't the case. The water was very hard, and it wasn't cutting it any better, and it was becoming unusable for domestic manufacturing purposes. You know, hard water, calcium deposits, and clogging pipes and so forth. So there was a lot of discomfort with the system. So in 1872, the council decided that they would allow a pipe to be run from the water plant out into the middle of the Ohio River with the idea that they would draw softer water from the river directly. Well, this required major reconstruction of the water plant, and it caused problems with the foundation of the water plant, but they ultimately got the pipe laid. Troubles were not ending though with regard to the water pipe, because they were drawing, of course, from the river, and it would get clogged up. And then the lines started breaking. And after some investigation, some divers went down, and it was determined that the pipe had not been laid properly. It had been laid on a sandy bed. It had not been pinned down, so to speak, to prevent the pipe from moving. Well, unfortunately, that was not done. One funny thing about this is Clarkson and Schinkel, when the contract for the building of the water plant building was originally being proposed, said that there ought to be a provision for a pipe being run out into the river, which could have been built into the foundation. And people got so upset with Schinkel and Clarkson about that Clarkson and Schinkel threatened to resign, but they were persuaded not to. So I'm sure that Clarkson had a chuckle when his idea that should have been done in the first place was put into place by running this pipe out into the river. There were also complaints about how the contract for the pipe out into the river was let. The point being that there were lots of accusations of corruption over the next few years in the operation of the waterworks. At one point in this time period, the city council decided to seize control of the waterworks from the waterworks board, and depending on who spoke about it, it was either the seizure was either to facilitate corruption or to prevent corruption. So whichever happened, I don't know, but there was plenty of claims of corruption in all aspects of all this. This is a slide showing you the location of a hill in the west of Covington, as it was then, called Forest Hill. It was owned by a real estate investor named Edwin Forrest. And the reason I tell you about this is because, as you might expect, the water that was being drawn from the Ohio River was contaminated by the products of three cities, Campbell County, Newport, Covington, and Cincinnati. Covington because, among other things, the Licking River was used for manufacturing. There was a lot of manufacturing in Covington in this time period. So, and Cincinnati, of course, was very industrial too, and with the breweries and the slaughterhouses and all that. You can imagine what the Ohio River was like, and the city was drawing water directly out of that supply. Well, somebody said, okay, let's put a reservoir up on Forest Hill and draw the water up and let it settle there so that it could then be piped in a more sanitary fashion to the citizens that were connected with the water supply. Well, the newspapers went crazy about this because so much money had already been spent on the system as it existed, and it would still be a process of drawing from a filthy river. And this is a bit of doggerel that was published in the newspapers. I can't tell whether you can see that or not. I know some people hate to be read to, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. For our reservoir on the hill, refuse from the public stables, morsels from dissecting tables, water yellowed full of mud, cats and dogs and bullocks' blood, decaying stuff from near and far, pumped into our reservoir, ashes, rubbish, billy goats, hoop skirts, bustles, dying shoats, fowls that die from ancient age, all these are our heritage. Sell your bonds for not less than par, all to build our reservoir. So, you can tell that the city citizenry were not all that enthused about this process that was proposed. Plus, the public was actually torn between improvement of the water system and getting a free bridge over to Cincinnati. You know, of course, by this time, the suspension bridge was opened up, and it was a toll bridge. And so there were a lot of accusations that Amos Shingle was promoting water in Covington so that there wouldn't be money to build the free bridge. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that was an accusation. In 1883, the city scheduled an election for August of that year to have a vote on whether the reservoir up on Forest Hill would be built or not. And they were encouraging, as you probably can't see, they were encouraging the populace to vote in favor of it. Well, the populace voted 279 in favor and 2,079 opposed. So that fell through. Now, there was a silver lining to all of this, though. The fact that there was a water system of some fashion. Some of you may have been kind enough to listen to a presentation I made here last year about cholera in Covington, 1832 to 1873. We had 3 cholera epidemics in Covington in that time period. And this is a slide which shows you the morbidity rate in Covington in the 1849-1850 epidemic. Now, as I said at the time, these little pins that I've got marked here really don't tell the whole story because a lot of people's deaths didn't get reported. I extracted this information from newspapers and so forth. So this is just to show you that there was a good amount of cholera in Covington in the 1849-50 epidemic. Now this is the same map, 1873, for the 1871-72 epidemic. Now you'll notice that there's very little, very few of the green pins. Again, I can't tell if that, oh. Anyway, very few of the green pins in what we'll call the bulk of Covington. But there's a lot of green pins up in that upper right-hand corner. Now, what I've done is mark with the red marker the area that the new waterworks was covering by this time. Now you still see a few spots of cholera in that area, and cholera, of course, is one of those kinds of diseases that would be you'd contact with contaminated material in some way or the other. And there were still cisterns, there were still wells in this same area, and not everybody was hooked up to the water, but a large number of people had been by this time in this area. So it seems to me that, as I say, the silver lining was that the cholera in the area served by the water system was almost non-existent, whereas in the area that it was not served, still had a significant amount of cholera. So that was the good news. Okay, after all these failures, and the fact that the water, as it was being removed from the river, was removed at a point where the offal of 3 cities was contaminating the river, they decided that they would have a system whereby a pumping station would be put on the Ohio River above Newport, below the Highlands, what's now is Fort Thomas or the Highlands, and there would be reservoirs built behind Newport so that there would be a gravity-fed system after it was pumped up from the river. It would then be a gravity-fed system. And these things never got done without trouble. 3 different contractors worked on the reservoirs. The first one was removed from the work. The second simply gave up. And the third one got the job accomplished. The first contractor that was removed from the job sued Covington and got a judgment for $130,000, which is about $3 million in today's money. So it was a very expensive process, and this is a cartoon that was in one of the newspapers, local newspapers, referring to a leak in the waterworks, and they showed the original cost and the cost of the judgment, and then they listed some money by various individuals' names, with the implication, of course, that these people had been bribed. But the odd thing about it is, if you look up at the top, it's got a cartoon caption says county treasury. Well, the county didn't have any money in this, so this was just a stock cartoon that they used whenever they wanted to talk about bribery, I guess. But in any event, things moved on. This is a picture of the original water pumping station, another version of it, down on the Ohio, down below now Fort Thomas. This is a picture of the first crew that operated the pumping station down below Fort Thomas. That is not the Holly machinery, of course, behind it. That's an entirely different set of machinery. Steam operated, pumped the water up to the reservoirs. This is a picture of a plaque that was installed when the waterworks buildings up above Newport were constructed, giving the names of the people that were involved. And this plaque still exists on a building there. I'll tell you about it in a bit. This is a picture from about 1914 of the waterworks as they were at that time. And what it was a system of 3 reservoirs. And the idea was that the water would be pumped up, and then it would be allowed to settle, and then that water would be moved to the next reservoir, and then to the next one, so that relatively clean water was being sent to the piping, through the piping into Covington. But there were problems with that in the times that there was so much demand for water that the water that was ultimately pumped to the cities was essentially, again, the Ohio River water. So that was not a good idea, but in any event, they were having costs overruns, lawsuits, and so forth. And in 1893, they meaning the Covington Water Works, started offering water for sale to other cities. Now, this was seen by some as a ploy to promote annexation by Covington of whatever area was being offered the water. For example, Latonia, which was then known as Milldale, was offered water from Covington, and there was resistance to that by some people, saying that this was just simply an attempt to take over Milldale, Latonia, and of course that ultimately happened. In 1895, the Covington Commercial Club wanted to know why water revenues were being spent on street improvements. And it was just too easy, as we'll see later. It was just too easy for politicians to use the revenues from the water district, from the water system, on other things. I mean, if you're a politician and the streets need repair and you're going to have to raise taxes, which people won't like, but you can boost the water rate by $1 or $2, and people have to take the water, then your temptation is to tap the water supply for not water but money. And so we'll see that actually happened. In 1896, a particular irritant started happening. Periodically, the county of Newport and the city of, or the district of the Highlands, would file suit to foreclose on the Covington Water Works in Campbell County because claimed that the taxes should have been paid on the value of the waterworks. And this went on for several years. Ultimately, this problem went away when there were some court decisions that ruled in favor of Covington. But it was a problem. Now, before 1903, the waterworks had been operated by some commissioners as an independent agency. Let's see. Then in December of 1903, the council abolished the commission and created a new board, which was to be appointed by the mayor. And this is just another example of some of the political infighting that went on in this period of time. After the Civil War, of course, the pro-South politicians were the Democrat Party, and the others were the Republican Party, maybe some others too. But the point is that there was a lot of political infighting. And I make no attempt in the book to analyze exactly who did what in terms of politics, but the impression that I can get and I'll give you, is that there was a lot of political infighting. And this was just another step in one party or the other trying to seize control of things. And it was at this point that seriously the waterworks became a cash cow, that they would tap regularly for things other than for the water system. In 1919, a grand jury reported that the system was being wrecked through negligence, meaning that the system was not being properly funded and maintained. You're probably wondering at what point they stopped drinking sewer water and started drinking something that was more palatable, or potable, I guess is the proper term. So in August of 1919, chlorination finally began. Now, shortly after that, a report by the United States Public Health Service said that the Ohio River was an open sewer, that water in northern Kentucky was unfit to drink. You get where I get the title, fit to drink? And that the chlorination that was being used was insufficient, and that a filtration plant was needed. A filtration plant would receive the water from the river in its unsanitary condition, and through a process they put alum in to do what they call flocculation, that is to clump debris together, and then be able to filter it so that it was more sanitary. So ultimately, by 1937, with a federal grant, the city got its filtration plant. That building still exists up there. You can't get up and see the waterworks anymore because of security reasons. They require you to have some good purpose for being up there, and the gates are locked and so forth and so on. I'm sure we're all happy about that. I was blessed with being given contact with the folks up there, and because of their interest in my book, or the topic of my book, they let me come up and go through the building, the filtration building, which has been substantially changed. It had a fountain in the middle of it, and the system for filtration is obviously much different now. But in any event, there's another plaque that shows the people that were involved in the obtaining of the filtration plant in 1937. That's on the wall up there, and that's where that other plaque of the original building that I told you about is also posted. And there are 4 bas-reliefs of what they call the history of water supply up in that building. So the bas-reliefs are original, the terrazzo floor is original, and the outside of the building is original, but the rest of it's pretty much modernized. Speaking again of sanitation, they tried to fluoridate the water in 1960, and the voters wouldn't have any of it, and voted it down. In 1967, I guess they thought maybe they'd just go ahead and install it, but protests caused them to remove the fluoridation system. And I think most of you are not old. Most of you, for sure, are old enough to remember the furor about fluoridation. It was going to kill us, it was going to poison us, and there were a lot of people who just did not want it. But nonetheless, in 1973, it was installed permanently because the state required it. Now, during all this time, other areas of the county were growing up. And as they were established, little towns that we all know today, they needed water. In 1892, a company called Kenton Water Company was formed by Valentine Collins, John P. Coppin, and Michael C. Mach. Now, Coppin and Mach, I'm sure you know the names of. Collins is not as well known today, although he did a lot of public works. He was a member of the Collins history family, and he deserves probably more mention today than he gets. But in any event, they tried to form a company. 1901, A.S. Berry Water Plant at Southgate. Union Light Heat and Power had a water tower in Fort Thomas. About 1915, the Dixie Water Company was formed. Not the Dixie Highway Water Company. The Dixie Water Company was formed. 1921, the Forest Hills Water Company was formed. Now, that's not the Forest Hill on the west part of Covington, but that's the Forest Hill out on Taylor Mill. Then in 1925, the Dixie Highway Water Company was formed. That was the water company that was to supply the cities that were growing up along the highway going from Covington. All of them were buying their water from Covington. Now, in case you've ever wondered what that little white building is at the Big Bend as you come out of Covington or as you go into Covington, that little white building, That is the original pumping station of the Dixie Highway Water Company. I saw it online one time. I saw somebody saying, "What is this building?" Well, that's what this building is. I don't know who puts those little plastic flowers out in front of it. If you ever notice there's pots. You do that?
No. Fort Mitchell Garage does it.
Ah, okay. All right, well, good for them. It decorates it a little bit. But that's what it is, in case you've ever wondered. Now, by 1935, the Kenton County Water Commission had been formed. It was supplying various parts of Kenton County, but it was buying its water from Covington. Now, they competed for sales, the two entities, Covington Water Works and the Dixie Highway, Kenton County Water Commission. They competed for sales, but they also cooperated in that they had their lines tied together in a way that if something happened untoward with one of them, that the other was able to supply water. So it was a friendly competition, so to speak. But then in 1956, the Kenton County Water Commission District opened its own plant on the Licking River, drawing water from the Licking. I remember being told one time when there was a complaint about water that where I lived, we didn't get the water from the Ohio, we got it from the Licking. Well, I didn't understand that. I had no interest in that, like so many people. What interest do you have in water unless you don't have it? So they opened their own plant, a treatment plant, and this was going to cause a financial loss for Covington, and did. It increased Covington's attempts to sell water to other cities and locations, which could sometimes cause problems. But in any event, by 1962, the Kenton County Water District plant couldn't supply all the customers it had. It was supplying a big part of Kenton County, and it couldn't supply everybody. At the same time, Covington was operating at 1/3 capacity, and they were expecting more loss of sales. So it was a critical time. But despite all these things, the diversion of money continued. In 1971, the Northern Kentucky Area Planning Report pointed out that in 1969, Covington's waterworks had derived $884,000 in revenue. $229,000 of that had been diverted to other areas. Now, how can you have a properly maintained system if you're diverting that much money to other causes? This goes all the way back to the complaints by the Covington Business Association about council using the money for other purposes. And I'll say again, if a politician has to make a choice between raising taxes and getting money from some other source, what's he or she going to do? Well, they did it. By 1976, there were 3 major water systems in northern Kentucky. And someone, mayor of Covington, I believe it was, proposed that Covington and the Kenton County Water District merge. By 1977, the Kenton County Water District was actually operating the Covington system. In 1979, the Kenton County Water District and the City of Covington made a proposal to the Public Service Commission that they be allowed to merge. In August of 1879, the petition was approved. So after 108 years of fits and starts, some successes, a lot of steps backward, after 108 years, the Covington Waterworks were no longer an independent operation. And that was the end of the system and the end of my talk. So, thanks for coming. I'll answer any questions that you might have. We've got the book for sale. I got my wife here to shill, and she ought to stand up and say, "This is a great book, buy more." But anyway, the books are $20 a piece, $5 of which goes to the Kenton County Historical Society. They're here and they're out there. So, yes, sir, question?
When you were just talking about in early years, they had cisterns and wells. The question is, was that under pressure to the areas around them? And number two, did you say they were pumping river water into their cisterns early on?
There was never a pumping system for the cisterns or the wells. The wells were draw the water up, the cisterns were get down and get the water. And that's part of the problem with the cisterns, is because if you've got such easy access, debris, mud, et cetera, can get down into the cisterns. So no, there was no pumping system. What was the second question?
Did they pump, you said they pumped water from the Ohio into the cisterns?
There was one time, at least one time, in which there was so little rain and so little water in the cisterns throughout the city that they pumped with a steam engine, steam fire engine. I think they borrowed one from Cincinnati, but at any rate, they pumped water from the Ohio River through hoses up to this cistern, filled it up, then hooked hoses from that cistern to the next cistern, pumped the water from that cistern to the next one, and so on and so on. And through a process, finally filled up the cisterns, the necessary cisterns, from the Ohio through that cumbersome process. But yeah, that happened, yeah. Yes, sir.
The final end of outhouses in Covington, maybe there are still some, but when did they put in other ways to remove fluids and waste?
You know, I don't know, because this was totally different from the sanitary sewer system. So I really don't know, but it's amazing to me, and I mentioned in the book, I can't remember the date, but it was well after the water system was fairly sophisticated, that some people were still using cisterns. I guess if you didn't want to pay for the water, you thought the rain would take care of you. But yeah, the cisterns operated for a long time, and they were all over the place. There was a large cistern. Actually, I think I marked it on one of the maps. Up by the Oddfellows Hall on 5th Street, by the Oddfellows Hall. Of course, the one that was so clogged with mud over by the present Mother of God Cemetery. There was one there. There was one in front of the Methodist Church, the one where Grant's parents worshiped. They were all over the place.
Was in Edgewood in the 60s and 70s, I know, people still had cisterns. Like they had a concrete slab over the front porch and down in the cistern. And they drained the rainwater off. But when it didn't rain, they would hire somebody like Jumbo. He had a business in Edgewood where he would deliver his truck to your place and fill it up at a nice price, I guess.
Yeah.
Compared to free.
Yeah.
And eventually those were displaced. But what are we operating under now? This is at an end in 108 years, but my bill now says Northern Kentucky Water Commission.
Northern Kentucky Water District Water Commission. It was through a process of consolidation with some of these other outfits. You know, my goal was to talk right about the Covington system and how long it lasted. There's lots of events regarding water after this merger that I mentioned. Yes, sir.
Have all those wells and cisterns been filled in?
Well, I can't say for sure, but I know that some of them have. And kind of interesting, I'm in the Covington Rotary, and we had a fellow speak some time ago who was a hydrologist, and he talked about how there were hardly any wells in Covington. And that's not true. There were lots of wells. Now, many of them got closed. I know that one, I remember reading about one that put cool air into a theater, and sulfur fumes were coming out of that one, so they had to fill that one in and block it. But yeah, there were lots of wells. I'm sure that they're all filled in now. Yes, sir.
There was a good number of brick line cisterns down there, some of which, a lot of them were filled. The privies did seem to stay open a lot longer than the cisterns. I would say towards the 1890s, turn of the century, a lot of the cisterns were being filled up. Done a lot of excavations down 11th and Green up, down at the Jacob Price area, and East 10th Street and East Robbins. And but not all the cisterns have been filled. We had one we cracked open, and it was hollow. But there's been some other ones that we've excavated there from 11th and Green up. They were actually filled with pretty much Christian, Moorline, and Bavarian beer bottles. There was, you could see filling sequences where the guys would stand out there and toss the bottles.
How are you involved with that? Tell us.
I was doing archaeological excavations. We were hired down there when they were building up the new projects there at the Jacob Price area. It was a federal project, federal money was being used, so they had to do the excavations on whatever was intact down there.
Cool.
And but we have noticed a pattern of the cisterns being closed up prior by using the stuff that we find, using the artifacts. We can date the cisterns being closed up a little earlier than the privies. And then the thing is, we took a look, just glanced at, how soon did they get electric, how soon did they get water, public services. And it wasn't like when the public water was available, everybody had it. It was a slow creep from, wherever they started laying the pipes. It was a real slow creep, more or less north to south. It took a lot longer for the outer areas to get those public services. It wasn't a quick turnaround. It took decades. And then there's some people that just refused it, too.
Yeah, and at the same time, they weren't, like you say, they weren't moving, rapidly necessarily, because people in Philadelphia started petitioning the city to have lines placed into their neighborhoods. So, yeah, they didn't get everywhere instantly. That's true. That's interesting, your comments about that. And a friend from Covington Rotary, Angie Billiter, who's a co-owner of the Earl Franks and Sons and Daughters company, when I made a presentation on this to Rotary, said that somebody had wanted to find out where some water was coming from, leaking into the basements or whatever, and so they started pumping water into this supposedly vacant spot, and none of the water ever came into the building, so they just pumped hundreds of thousands of gallons into this place. And so we can only presume that there's a cistern there somewhere around Earl Franks and Sons and Daughters that's unfilled, so except with maybe some water. I think, yes, sir.
As a kid, there's some reservoir type of thing on top of the hill south of 26th Street. Can you tell me anything about that?
Yeah. The system is designed to have pressure by reason of gravity. There was, I think, one spot, there was a pumping station that needed to be installed to get it up a hill or whatever. But there was a huge tank that was buried just above 26th Street. There's also one up in Blue Park.
Right below Prisoner's Lake.
Exactly, yes. And these were called equalizing tanks. And the idea is by having them filled, that there would not be any particular breaks, so to speak, in the pressure coming from the reservoirs in Fort Thomas. So yes.
What system and what time frame was that?
Just a joke. I'll buy the book and it tells you. I don't remember the dates. Okay. I don't remember the dates, but I do talk about it in the book. Okay. And so yeah, that's interesting that you know that. Yes, sir.
Yes. In your presentation, you mentioned an individual named Vincent Schimel. And I was wondering, what was his relationship to Amos?
Brother.
Older brother.
Oh yeah, brother.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
And where did Covington pump their water out of which river when it started their water system?
Ohio. It was out of the Ohio.
Was that by the Willow Run or
Well, the first one was down at the pumping station at 2nd and Main. That was the first one. And it pumped water from the Ohio River right about there. After that system was abandoned, then it was the pumping station that's just above Newport, below Fort Thomas, on the Ohio River. Yeah. So there had only been 2 pumping stations. They have been refurbished or whatever, but the original one, and I wish I had a picture. Nobody apparently ever took a picture of the original building, and it was supposed to be very nice, had a fountain in front of it, and a yard and that sort of thing. And I based on things I read after after the system was abandoned, they used the building sometimes as an incinerator, sometimes as storage, and I'm told that it could have existed as late as 1960, but I didn't know anything about it at the time. Of course, he was out there in the city. Anything else? Yes?
You talked about the water system, of the pumping and the fresh water. At what point was a sewer system built for Covington?
Just like that was his question too, and I don't know because I was only interested in water.
Fresh water.
Yeah, so I did not do any work on the sewer sanitation.
Another subject to be done.
I don't know.
Most of that was done like turn of the century, post turn of the century,
Sounds right.
from what we found.
Yeah. And interesting fact, Covington never had wooden water pipes. Cincinnati, in their system, of course, that started much earlier, they used the hollow log kind of thing to a certain extent, but Covington never had any such pipes. Remember the piping contractor that sued? Well, that's how it started, iron pipes. So, anything else?
The Cincinnati Fire Museum up around Court Street, and that, they have examples in their basement of water pipes that are wooden. I mean, I guess that's where the term fire plug came from, because the wooden pipes would be laid, and then when they come to a fire, they would drill it out and put a fire plug on it, pump it out, just fight the fire.
On one of the plaques that you showed, the name was J. O'Hara. Was that a different O'Hara type?
No
Okay.
connection to that.
Okay.